Richard Beasley lured men with fake jobs on Craigslist and killed them. Sean Ford murdered his girlfriend's parents with a sledgehammer. Antonio Franklin murdered his grandparents and uncle with a baseball bat and set the house on fire. Terry Froman kidnapped and murdered his ex-girlfriend and her son. Clarence Fry stabbed his girlfriend to death. Larry Gappin murdered his ex-wife, her companion, and her 13-year-old daughter with a wood-splitting maul. Garrett Christopher stabbed his ex-girlfriend and their 4-year-old daughter. James Goff robbed and murdered an 88-year-old woman after delivering furniture to her home. Sean Great murdered over 5 women before his arrest in 2016. Group Scott shot and killed a bar owner during a planned robbery. Hale Delano shot a man multiple times, wrapped his body in plastic and left it in a motel room. Gerald Hand murdered his wife and friend for financial gain. James Hanna killed his cellmate while already serving a life sentence for murder. Jerome Henderson fatally stabbed his neighbor during an attempted sexual assault. Warren Heinous robbed and murdered a man who was helping his wife seek drug treatment. Danny Hill kidnapped, tortured, and murdered a 12-year-old boy on his way to a Boy Scout meeting. Timothy Hoffner and his accomplice murdered a 22-year-old man. Gary Eubanks murdered a married couple during a home burglary. Lance Hundley murdered a disabled woman, attempted to kill her mother, and set their house on fire. Percy Hutton murdered a man over a dispute involving a sewing machine and attempted to kill another. Cleveland Jackson killed a 17-year-old and a 3-year-old during a robbery. Jeremiah Jackson murdered a woman during a laundromat robbery and went on a 17-day crime spree. Kareem Jackson executed 2 men during a drug-related robbery. Nathaniel Jackson conspired with a woman to murder her ex-husband. Stanley Jalowek murdered a police informant. George Brinkman killed a mother and her 2 daughters, then murdered an elderly couple days later. Kwesi Bryan fatally shot a police officer during a traffic stop. Anthony Kirkland murdered 2 women and 2 girls. Michael Madison murdered 3 women. Ahmed Nawaz killed his estranged wife, her father, sister, and niece. David Allen murdered a woman in 1991. Anthony Apanovich was convicted of rape and murder, exonerated by DNA, but later returned to death row. Abdul Alkal murdered his estranged wife and her brother. Anthony Belton executed a convenience store clerk during a robbery. Robert Bethel murdered 2 people in a drug-related crime. Melvin Bonnell killed a man in Cleveland in 1987. Grady Brinkley murdered his 18-year-old ex-girlfriend. Samuel Moreland killed his girlfriend, her daughter, and 3 grandchildren. Lee Moore murdered a man during a robbery and kidnapping. Jonathan Monroe killed 2 women in 2001. Freddie McNeil murdered a man during a drug deal. Sean Carter killed his 82-year-old adoptive grandmother. Stephen Sepek murdered a 72-year-old man. David Chin murdered a man during a robbery and kidnapping. Curtis Clinton killed a woman and her 2 children. Timothy Coleman executed a police informant to silence her testimony. Coley Douglas killed a man during a kidnapping and robbery, then murdered a woman during a carjacking. Conway James killed a man with a pickaxe. Derek Cook killed a 68-year-old store manager during a kidnapping, robbery, and murder. Calvin McKelton murdered his girlfriend and another man to prevent testimony. Gregory McKnight kidnapped and murdered a 20-year-old woman and another man. David Martin murdered a 21-year-old man and shot a woman during a robbery. Charles Maxwell murdered a woman in retaliation for her testimony. Joseph McAlpin murdered a couple and their dog during a robbery. James Mamone murdered his 5-year-old daughter, 3-year-old son, and former mother-in-law. Jeronique Cunningham killed a 17-year-old girl and a 3-year-old child during a robbery. Vaughn Davis killed his ex-girlfriend while on parole for a previous murder. Archie Dixon killed his roommate during a robbery and kidnapping, burying him alive. Victoria Drain killed a fellow inmate with a fan motor, stomped on his throat, and drove a pencil into his eye. John Drummond killed a 3-month-old child during a drive-by shooting. Austin Gregory Myers killed an 18-year-old man during a robbery. Kessler Sapp murdered 2 young girls and a 28-year-old woman. Calvin Nayland murdered 2 men after being fired from his job. Matthew Nicholson murdered 2 teenagers during a domestic dispute. Tyrone Lee murdered an elderly couple, but no physical evidence linked him to the crime. Jose Loza killed 4 members of his girlfriend's family while they slept. Clarence Mack murdered a man during a carjacking. Michael Madison murdered 3 women between 2012 and 2013. Aaron Lawson murdered 4 family members and confessed to the killings. Carl Lindsay murdered a man. He was hired by the victim's wife to carry out the killing. Gregory Lott murdered an 82-year-old man during a robbery, setting him on fire. Carlos Sanders ordered the murder of a corrections officer during the Lucasville prison riot. Denny Obermiller murdered his grandmother and step-grandfather over stolen coins. James Derrick O'Neill killed his estranged wife in 1993. Gregory Ozzie killed David Williams to prevent him from reporting thefts committed by his girlfriend. Carrie Perez murdered a man during a robbery at a Springfield bar in 2003. Mark Pickens murdered 19-year-old Noelle Washington and her 2 children after she reported him for sexual assault. Wayne Powell murdered his estranged girlfriend, her mother, and 2 children by setting their home on fire. Walter Raglan murdered a musician during an armed robbery in Cincinnati. Jason Harry Robb murdered 2 people during the Lucasville prison riot, including a corrections officer. Donna Marie Roberts hired someone and murdered her ex-husband. Martin Rojas assaulted, stabbed, and murdered Rebecca Scott in 1987. Dwayne Short murdered his estranged wife and her friend in Dayton, Ohio in 2004. Gurpreet Singh murdered his wife, father-in-law, mother-in-law, and aunt-in-law in a shooting incident. George Skatzis murdered 2 inmates and a corrections officer during the 1993 Lucasville prison riot. Kenneth Smith murdered a couple during a home invasion and robbery with his brother. Dawood Spaulding murdered his ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend, leaving another man paralyzed. John Stojets murdered a 17-year-old in a racially motivated prison attack. Lawrence Landrum murdered an elderly man during a burglary in 1985. Keith Lamar murdered fellow inmates during the 1993 Lucasville prison riot and maintains his innocence. Thomas Nuff murdered his housemates and concealed their bodies in trash bags in 2017. Audrey Jones murdered Ashtabula police officer William D. Glover, Jr. in 1997. Stanley Theodore murdered a woman, her 12-year-old daughter, and another lady in 1999. Andre Williams murdered a 65-year-old man and the attempted murder of his wife during a home invasion. Juan Kinley killed his 31-year-old girlfriend and her 12-year-old son with a machete. Philip Jones sexually assaulted and murdered Susan Yates in Akron, Ohio in 2007. Christopher Whitaker abducted, assaulted, tortured, and murdered a 14-year-old girl. Hersey Wesson murdered 81-year-old Emil Varhola during a robbery. John Stumpf murdered a 54-year-old woman during a robbery at her home. James Tench murdered his mother, Mary Tench, whom he beat and ran over with her vehicle. James Worley kidnapped and murdered 20-year-old Sierra Jugan, whom he abducted while she was cycling, assaulted, and killed. Jeffrey Wogenstall kidnapped and murdered 10-year-old Amber Garrett, his neighbor's daughter. James Trimble killed his girlfriend, her 7-year-old son, and a Kent State University student, Sarah Positano. Thank you for watching till the end. Which state would you love me to cover next? Comment below.